Hello, everyone. This is going to be 2.4 Immigration and Slavery in the Colonies. And we are going to start with a quote from Oluda Equiano, who wrote one of the most famous slave narratives, the story of what it was like to be an enslaved person from that side of it, not just somebody looking from outside and, talking about what they see. And he said, "Such a tendency has the slave trade to debauch men's minds and harden them to every feeling of humanity. For I will not suppose that the dealers in slaves are born worse than other men. No, it is the fatality of this mistaken avarice, that it corrupts the milk of human kindness and turns it into gall." So, obviously, Aluda Equiano does not have a positive look at the slave trade. Our objectives: we are going to explain how European immigration to the colonies changed between the late 1600s and into the 1700s. We're going to analyze the development of slavery in the colonies. And lastly, we are going to describe the experience of enslaved Africans in the colonies as well. So let's start with immigrants populating these colonies. So, after the foundation of the 13 colonies, with all of their different changes and the things that make them unique, they all started to grow and get bigger. They started to expand, and a lot of this came due to European immigration, particularly from England, but also from other places as well. So, about 90% of the voluntary immigrants to America were English. About half of them are what we call indentured servants. And so, if you're an indentured servant, that means you could not pay your way. You couldn't pay for passage over to America. And so, what you would do is you would say, okay, when I get to America, I can't afford the passage, but when I get there, I will work it off. I will work for more or less for free for 4 to 7 years in order to pay off the passage that somebody else paid for me, basically. And these indentured servants would get the basics. They would get clothes, food, shelter, maybe a little bit of money, maybe a little bit of land. And at the end of their service, they would get some kind of payment, hopefully, that would set them up so that they could become a small farmer in America. Now, by about 1660, the job market had actually improved in England to the point where indentured servants weren't queuing up to come over to America anymore. And this is a problem because uh, running a farm in America is tough work. It's tough business. And they needed people to do the tough manual labor, and they weren't getting it from England anymore. Now, the first group to replace the English were the Scots, people from Scotland, technically from Great Britain, although don't tell that to the Scots or they will punch you in the face. Scots at that time were generally less well off than English immigrants, and they had more reason to come over to America. They still were poor, and so they were still willing to come over and face the hard conditions and do the hard work for little to no money, for the hope of future being well off. They also became a part of Great Britain in 1707. This is when Great Britain became Great Britain. So Great Britain is the combination of Scotland, Wales, England, and Ireland. What was at that time Ireland, now Northern Ireland. And so when we say English and British, the two are not necessarily just interchangeable. They have two different meanings. So here's a map of Great Britain as it is today, with Scotland up north, England in the south, Wales to the west. It used to be all of Ireland was part of Great Britain. Now Northern Ireland is part of Great Britain, but the rest of Ireland is its own independent country. Now, the Scots who moved over to America, became everything from merchants to governors. Many of them succeeded in a variety of different ways, and many of them were sort of a combination of two different groups. They were the descendants of the Protestant Scottish who had moved to Northern Ireland and set up shop there, so they were called the Scots-Irish. And a lot of these guys, these Scotch-Irish, didn't move to the big cities. So they didn't move to Boston or Philadelphia or other places. Instead, they moved to the back country, up in the mountains in the western colonies. And you can actually still find Scots-Irish descendants living in the Appalachian Mountains up through today. So, about 100,000 Germans came over too during this time, many of them Protestants, There was no Germany at this time. There was no country of Germany. There were several German kingdoms, principalities, basically. But many of them were running away from uh, bad wars, heavy taxes, religious persecution, and the fact that there was not enough land. And so at this time, uh, this was a time of civil war in Germany. Eventually, Germany would unite in the 1800s, but at this time, they are a bunch of warring principalities. And so here are all the kingdoms of Germany during that time, and you can see all the different sort of nation states that made up Germany at that time. So, in 1682, William Penn allowed some of these Germans to settle in Pennsylvania. Um, if you recall, Pennsylvania was much more welcoming and open to other people who were not necessarily English, not necessarily, uh, you know, straight up Anglicans. They were willing to allow anybody in as long as they were doing the work while they were there. And the Germans actually did very well, and there's still some parts of Pennsylvania where you can hear people talk with a sort of different accent. It almost, to my ears at least, sounds a little bit Irish, but actually it's this accent of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Is what they're called. These are the descendants of people who came from Germany to America, settled in Pennsylvania, and they oftentimes still live in sort of enclaves. So here's where the Pennsylvania Dutch often live in Pennsylvania, at least back in the day. Now, this wave of immigration changed what a lot of these colonies were founded for. So, if you think back, Maryland was for Catholics, Pennsylvania was for Quakers, so on and so forth. Pennsylvania was meant to be mainly for Quakers, but after the German and the Scots-Irish came over, the Quakers were not the majority anymore. If they ever had been, they were now deeply in the minority. And so what we see is that the demographics of America start to change with immigration. And the setup and the structure of these colonies start to change a little bit. And so it had to lead to some form of toleration, otherwise nobody would get along with anybody. Now let's see how enslaved Africans came over to America. So, English indentured servants stopped coming over due to the fact that the job market actually got better over in England, and there were worries that people who did come over would start rebellions. Guys like Nathaniel Bacon, who came over, was an indentured servant and was unhappy with how he was being treated. So the colonies needed a new source of labor to work on these farms and do the hard labor, and so they turned to Africa for this. The first enslaved Africans in North America were brought to Virginia in 1619. And they were actually pretty late to the game, the English were. By the time a slave ship called the White Lion came to Jamestown in 1619, there had been African slaves working in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, for a long time before this. The first ones who were brought to Virginia were initially treated like indentured servants. So some of these enslaved Africans were freed after a few years. Some even got to buy their own land and eventually some even bought slaves of their own. This, however, would not last. Pretty quickly, colonies began to pass laws that said slavery was going to be a lifetime thing, and not just for you, but also for your children, too. So slavery was it was passed down from parent to child. It was also confined to the African race, and this is by law. They started to pass race laws, sometimes called black codes, that said certain things about, who could and could not become enslaved, or who could and could not be freed, and what work these people could do as well. And as a part of this brought about this belief that one race was above another race. This belief in racial superiority spread during this time. Now, most enslaved people were coming from West Africa. They were brought to the Caribbean or to the South America. Eventually, though, they started to come to mainland America as well. Slavery was eventually outlawed in the 1860s. The international slave trade was outlawed in the early 1800s. But hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were brought over, and then they had children, and their children were enslaved as well. And this is part of what's called the triangular trade. So, in the triangular trade, we're going to look at a picture of it in a second. Europeans would sail to Africa. They would trade goods for enslaved people. So, oftentimes, it was things that African kingdoms needed, such as guns. And then the slaves, the enslaved people, were brought to the Americas where they were traded for raw goods like molasses, which could be turned into rum. And these raw goods were sent to Europe to be made into manufactured goods, and the triangle continued that way. So this is what it basically looked like. So it depends on where you start, but raw materials were brought over to Europe. Europe sold manufactured goods to Africa, and African enslaved people were sent to the Caribbean islands and eventually to mainland North America as well. The worst part of this for the enslaved people was the Middle Passage. This is the voyage from Africa to the Caribbean. And it was on this that it was not accidental that they were treated this horribly. Enslaved people were dehumanized. The people who were in charge of these voyages tried to take away any sort of pretense of independence or thinking for yourself, or even the idea that they were human beings. They took away their names and gave them European names instead. They were branded, beaten, whipped, starved, stuffed into quarters below decks, which were hot and deadly with all the diseases flying around. If enslaved people were sick, they would not be fed, and some were even thrown overboard. Sometimes these slave ships would overstuff their numbers and put too many enslaved Africans into the bowels of this ship, with the idea that, well, they're not all going to survive the trip, so we may as well bring more, and then we'll have plenty when we get there. Women especially had the worst of it, because not only did they have these terrible conditions, but they were also targets of sexual assault by the sailors. Some historians have estimated that the death rates on the Middle Passage of enslaved Africans was as high as 10 to 20%, if not even higher than that. This is what they would put the enslaved Africans into the bottom of part of the ship, and they would be laying literally, side to side like this, cramped, no personal space, and they would be like this for weeks at a time. The only time they weren't like this was when they were brought onto the deck of the ship to basically keep them healthy, or moderately healthy. Now let's look at African slaves within the colonies as well. Life did not get better once they got to America. In fact, it often got worse. Families were separated on purpose in order to eliminate any sense of a family or friendships or bonding. They wanted these people to feel alone, and this helped to make sure that enslaved people were not going to rise up and rebel or try to escape. It made it much harder. Enslaved people were also forced to learn English in order to work. However, they were mixed in with people from other tribes, so they knew basic English, but some of them were not, taught a lot of English. And of course, reading was often right out of the question. It was not to be allowed, because if you allowed an enslaved person to read, the next thing they could do is they could start planning and plotting and get out. So, and it's an important thing to note that this section talks about how the lives of enslaved people were different depending on where they were. But it is important to note that there is no good version of slavery. It was different versions of slavery, which is in general, across the board, not a good thing. It did, however, vary depending on the region you were in. So there were slaves up in New England and in New York, places like that. However, they were comparatively less, thanks partially to the lack of big farms and plantations. They did not need as many enslaved people up north. So if you were up north, you probably worked in a small farm, you worked on a dock, you worked as a sailor, you worked as a servant. However, this did not mean that the North was, clean in the story of American slavery. Oftentimes, it was the North who were sailing the ships to Europe and to Africa and sailing them back to America. Most slaves lived in the South, where they made up about 40% of the population. There are some areas where there were actually more enslaved Africans than there were white people living in the area. And they did a lot of the really hard, backbreaking work, the dangerous work, the deadly work for hours at a time. So, um, it's important to realize, again, that this is not like, I'm not saying that this is the upside of slavery. I am saying that even in the worst of conditions, you cannot take away a person's humanity. So these enslaved Africans becoming African Americans started to develop their own culture even in bondage. And often it was a blend of African culture and European culture. So the enslaved people would mix African traditional spiritual beliefs with Christianity, and create religions like Santeria and Vodou, sometimes called voodoo. They also started to modify African instruments and play them, things like the banjo. So if you ever heard of banjo, this is basically a spin on an African instrument. Also things like bongo drums. They also brought over, their own ways of preparing and cooking food, and their own stories, and their own ways. Their even in some places their own language. There's a language known as Gullah, which is spoken still off the coast of South Carolina, which is a mixture of English and what is called Pidgin English. This sort of a mixture of English and African dialects that is still spoken up through today. So here is Vodou, an altar in New Orleans. And here is a banjo, which is they took the African instrument and sort of changed it a little bit for America. And despite the idea that, oftentimes the white slave owners tried to say that everything's fine, there were some even who said that, African enslaved people are passive. There are even some who created what is called the myth of the happy slave. They were not happy. They were not passive. They fought back. Some fought back violently. Others fought back in smaller ways. In cases of violent uprising during the pre-revolutionary era, probably the most famous one is the Stono River Rebellion in South Carolina, where in 1739 about 100 enslaved people rose up, killed 20 white people, but eventually the South Carolina state militia or colonial militia was called out, and most of them were killed, which they wanted to set an example that this is what happens to you if you rebel. This is what happens to you if you fight back, basically. Slaves who were part of the rebellion were executed as a warning. So this is a picture from the Stono Rebellion. Now, some slaves also ran away. There were places where they were accepted. So runaways of the American South often tried to make it to the Caribbean, where they were often called Maroons. The Maroons were enslaved Africans who had run away to the Caribbean. There were also some runaways who were welcomed into Native American tribes. The Spanish were happy to allow in enslaved Africans running away from the British, because this weakened the British colonies, and so oftentimes they were welcomed into places like Florida. Some enslaved people resisted bondage, if not by actively running away or rebelling, by what is known as passive rebellion. They would, they would work slowly. They would, if they were given an order, they would pretend not to understand it. They would intentionally break tools as a way to resist work. This did help to sort of at least, make sure that they weren't working as hard as they could have been. However, this did have the negative side effect that it created a stereotype of enslaved Africans being slow-witted, ignorant, not understanding the way things were. Very, very few enslaved Africans were allowed to buy their freedom, or may have been freed in some other manner. Perhaps the owner of these enslaved Africans might say in their will that after I die and after my wife dies, then I will release my enslaved people. Free African Americans generally moved to the bigger cities, generally in the north, particularly in places like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had a very low idea of slavery. The Quakers were naturally anti-slavery. Very, very, very few of these, very, very, very few managed to become distinguished in some ways. One of the most famous is a woman named Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved person in Boston who eventually became famous for a book of poems that she released in 1773. Others include people like Benjamin Banneker. He was born free. He was uh, half African American, half white. And he was a scientist who eventually helped to do things like he helped to survey Washington, D.C. after the Revolution and helped to plan it out, basically. So Banneker is another famous example of a freeman who gained some notoriety. So here's Phyllis Wheatley. We will take a look at one of her poems in class. Or actually, let's take a look at it right now. She said, this is Phyllis Wheatley to the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. This is a poem, but it's also a plea. She says, should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway. And here's Benjamin Banneker, who once said, the color of the skin is in no way connected to the strength of the mind or intellectual powers. He was called by no less than Thomas Jefferson one of the most intelligent men he had ever met.